The Netherlands is a relatively small country sandwiched between Belgium and Germany in the corner of Western Europe. Looking at a map, you wouldn't pay much attention to this tiny dot on the world stage. It doesn't really make the news much anymore, and has been largely relegated to the back of everybody's minds. But this modern description of the position of the Dutch state doesn't truly do justice to the historical significance this nation possesses. Because as it turns out, there was a point in history where the Dutch economy was the mitochondria of Europe, dominating trade across the continent and large parts of the world. They were at the forefront of global politics, being one of the wealthiest and most powerful nations on Earth, achieving monopolies on sugar, opium, nutmeg and many other spices. And even more impressively, they achieved all of this while fighting an 8-decade-long war of independence against the most powerful nation on the planet. If you're British, then that means your country was run by the Dutch leader for over a decade. If you're American, then that means the first international recognition of your country's independence came from the Netherlands. And historian James C. Kennedy argues that without the support from the Dutch, the Americans would not have been able to win their war of independence against the British. America, the most powerful nation in existence that has dominated trade and geopolitics for a century now, may not have existed without the Netherlands. The Dutch influence on history has been truly gargantuan, and is a dishonour to their country that their past is not better known by the world. So, let's try and fix that. Sit back and enjoy this extremely long YouTube video about the history of the Netherlands. Hi, welcome to my palace. We'll start our story in the 1380s when the rise of Burgundy began. For most of the past 1,000 years, the Netherlands has meant the area in modern-day Belgium, Luxembourg and the Netherlands. So for most of this video, I'll be talking about the history of the entire region, not just the modern-day Netherlands. Part 1. Burgundy. In 1363, Philip the Bold, youngest son of the French king, was made Duke of Burgundy. Nobody could have foreseen it at the time, but this promotion set the stage for the House of Burgundy to become one of the greatest European powers of the age. Because Philip the Bold was about to experience a series of lucky breaks that would take him and his descendants from the rulers of a tiny duchy in northern France to a level of power on par with any European kingdom. First, he married into the dynasty of the Count of Flanders, and then his new wife inherited Brabant and Luxembourg. From here, the family would, through a series of inheritances and marriages, expand their territory across the Low Countries. 2 generations later, they would get another huge opportunity to gain more land. In 1417, the Count of Holland, Zeeland and Hainaut died, leaving his 15-year-old daughter, Jacqueline, better known as Jacoba, in charge. Her uncle, John the Pitiless, felt like he should be the ruler of the territory instead, so he installed himself as her lieutenant and started acting as the de facto ruler of the country. And Jacoba didn't like this. How dare somebody else usurp her power? So, she immediately began looking for allies to get rid of John the Pitiless. Her first husband was already dead, so she remarried, only to find out that her new husband supported John. Ah well, there's plenty of fish in the sea. To find new fish, she went to England, where she married the Duke of Gloucester, and in 1424, when she was in her mid-20s, Gloucester and Jacoba landed in the Low Countries and retook Hainaut. A few days later, John the Pitiless found that somebody had smothered poison on his spellbook. He died, poison tends to have that effect, and now John was dead. We don't know if Jacoba killed him, by the way. She definitely had a motive. It's possible that she killed him, but we don't know for sure. So at this point, both of the books that I read gave a slightly different description of what happened next. But basically what happened was, now that John was dead, Jacoba thought she should be the ruler of all the land she'd inherited from her father. However, Philip the Good of Burgundy, it's a different Philip now because we're a couple of generations later, Philip the Good of Burgundy pointed out that John the Pitiless had appointed him as his successor, not Jacoba. Philip had a lot of support in Holland, Zeeland and Hainaut from the same lords that had supported John the Pitiless. At some point, John managed to imprison Jacoba, but Jacoba escaped, disguised as a man, and fled to a part of Holland. There, she rallied her supporters and fought a nearly 4-year-long civil war between her supporters and the supporters of Philip the Good. In 1428, Jacoba lost the civil war and was forced to submit to Philip's terms. Jacoba was allowed to remain the official Count of Holland, Zeeland and Hainaut, however don't be fooled. Philip is officially in charge. He runs the place, and Jacoba isn't allowed to get married without Philip's permission. And when Jacoba dies, Philip is going to be her heir. So she has effectively given up control to Philip. Except Philip doesn't have the time to rule all of Holland, Zeeland and Hainaut. And so one of the families in Holland and Zeeland pays Philip a regular fee in order to allow them to run the government of Holland and Zeeland. Now, do you remember how Jacoba isn't allowed to get married without Philip's permission? Well, that isn't going to stop Jacoba. In 1432, Jacoba secretly gets married. Who does she get married to? She gets married to the man whose family is paying Philip to let them run the country. And so now suddenly, she has a lot more power. And in 1434, when Philip finds out, he's furious, and he arrests her husband. Jacoba and Philip cut a deal. Jacoba's husband would be released from prison in exchange for Jacoba retiring and abdicating from all her territories. Jacoba agrees to this deal and she abdicates from all her positions, leaving Philip as the undisputed master of Holland, Zeeland and Hainaut. So now Philip and his family have carved out a pretty decent empire for themselves in the Low Countries. And things look like they're going extremely well. The Burgundian realms controlled a vital trade link between England, the Baltic, and Germany. And so, between 1400 and 1475, total trade volume in the region doubled, dominating things like the beer trade. They were an economic powerhouse on the continent, and the 1400s was probably the point in Belgian history where they experienced the highest quality of life up to that point in time, a record only broken in the 1800s. This was in contrast to the rest of Europe, which was economically struggling due to the plague, wars, and high taxes. During his reign, Philip the Good did his best to centralise his lands as much as possible, setting up a common currency across the Low Countries, attempting to standardise taxation across his realms, and installing a high court whose rulings would be applied across his domains. In order to make his appeals for taxation easier, Philip the Good created a central ruling council called the States General, where all of the states under his control had representation. Philip didn't know it yet, but one day the States General would have quite an important role in achieving Dutch independence from the Spanish. For now, Burgundy was still a relevant power that needed to be respected by those in the surrounding regions. Unfortunately for Philip, the only thing faster than his family's rise to prominence would be his family's fall from grace. In 1465, an aging Philip gave up power to his son, Charles, who he didn't like very much. Charles had a much more aggressive foreign policy than his father, partly because he loved reading history books about Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. Charles would go on to bring Burgundy to the height of its power, conquering new land, connecting the territories of Burgundy and the Low Countries, and it looked like Burgundian power could only grow. His daughter had been betrothed to the son of the Holy Roman Emperor. If this marriage went through, then Burgundy would have the protection of the mighty Hapsburg family, one of the most powerful families in Europe. This alliance could secure Burgundian gains for generations to come. Not only that, but it seemed like there was about to be another massive boost in Charles's power. You see, Burgundy and Flanders, both ruled by the Burgundian family, were still counties in France. So, depending on where we're talking about here, the Duke of Burgundy was either subordinated to France or an independent noble, and Charles didn't like that. The 100 Years' War was a century-long war in which England attempted to gain control of the French throne, and Burgundy had sided with England during that war decades earlier. Now, Burgundy and England felt like trying again, so they coordinated an alliance and prepared for an attack on France. But at the last minute, Burgundy had to call off their attack because the Duke of Lorraine really didn't like that Charles had taken over his duchy, so Lorraine sided with the Swiss to retake their lost land. Charles was forced to call off his attack on France in order to hold Lorraine. The Swiss looted Charles's camp, defeated his army, and mutilated his corpse, leaving his 19-year-old daughter Mary in charge. Charles had been on the verge of greatness. He was this close. He could have made an alliance with the Hapsburgs. He could have taken over France, or part of it anyway. Instead, history showed itself to be an arena where the slightest thing can make everything go wrong. Taking advantage of the situation, several territories, including the ones Charles had conquered during his lifetime, took the opportunity to declare independence, while France came in and seized yet more land. The remaining states controlled by Mary got together in the States General to make demands of her. They forced her to agree to something known as the Great Privilege of 1477. You see, when Philip implemented his centralisation policies, he was very careful not to anger anybody and to do that centralisation in a prudent way. Charles the Bold was a lot more bold and infuriated the states and made them detest his centralisation policies. And so they wanted them undone. In the Great Privilege of 1477, Mary agreed, among other things, not to raise taxes or go to war without the consent of the states. The Great Privilege was similar to their Magna Carta. It would go on to serve the states for long after it was signed. 100 years later, it would be used in a revolution against Spanish domination. Meanwhile, in the 1470s, Mary saw her empire collapsing around her and realised she needed some help if she was going to stay afloat. Luckily, she was due to marry the son of the Holy Roman Emperor, Maximilian of Hapsburg. So she married the man, giving her the protection of the Holy Roman Emperor and the Hapsburg family. Mary would fall from her horse and die when she was 25 years old, leaving Maximilian Hapsburg to rule in the place of her 3-year-old son. This left the lands of Burgundy, or what was left of it, firmly under the control of the Hapsburgs. So with that, one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe had been entirely undone with just 2 untimely deaths in a row. The independence of Burgundy was at an end. Meanwhile, the Habsburgs were reaching the height of their power. Okay, if you're wondering what that discrepancy in the last scene was, I wrapped green pipe cleaner around part of the crown, causing the green screen to key it out. That was a mistake of mine. Anyway, back to the story. The Habsburgs were a powerful family that ruled large chunks of land across Europe, and exclusively held the position of Holy Roman Emperor. Part 2, the Habsburgs. Within a few decades of them taking over the lands of the House of Burgundy, they had expanded north and conquered the lands in the modern-day Netherlands. The Habsburgs built upon Philip's centralisation policies, attempting to, but not completely succeeding in, standardising the legal system across the provinces. The Low Countries were vital to the Habsburgs, partly because of their extreme wealth. The city of Antwerp, for instance, was the most important port in Europe and the most populated city in Europe after Paris. Between the 1520s and the 1550s, the Habsburgs were in a state of almost constant war against the French, and in the 16th century, war had become much more expensive than it was previously. With cannons becoming much more effective, armies and fortifications also had to become more effective if they didn't want to get blown to bits, and to pay for that, military budgets had to increase. To finance his expensive wars with France, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V had to heavily tax the Low Countries for much more than their fair share to pay for the conflict. However, there were downsides to this. Due to the Great Privilege of 1477, the ruler couldn't implement any taxes without the consent of the states. So places like Holland and Flanders were able to extract massive concessions from the emperor in exchange for those high taxes. Holland, for instance, paid in the 1550s 10 to 15 times more in taxes than they had paid in 1520, and increasingly, those taxes became loans. The markets of Antwerp credited 60 times as much money to Charles V at the end of his reign than they had done at the start of his reign. And how did his reign come to an end again? Well, in the last few decades, the church had started allowing people to buy their way into heaven for a hefty price. That way, a poor person had to go to the effort of following the teachings of the Bible and just being a good person all round, but a rich person can simply pay a fee and guarantee a place in heaven regardless of what they did. A guy called Martin Luther didn't like this blatant corruption and hammered 95 theses to the church door, explaining why that's bad actually. In 1519 he split with the church and founded Lutheranism, another sect of Christianity. This inspired numerous other people to also split from the church. Groups like the Mennonists, the Calvinists and the Anabaptists were created, all of whom declaring that Catholicism was no longer the way to go. And best believe Charles V didn't like that. In 1521, the Holy Roman Emperor declared that being Protestant was a capital crime. However, there was a loophole in the law that allowed you to bestow a lesser punishment upon Protestants, such as a fine or a banishment. This law meant that if you were caught being a Calvinist or a Lutheran or something else that wasn't Catholic, then you probably wouldn't be executed. However, in 1531, the Emperor closed that loophole, and by 1535, getting found guilty of being a Protestant almost certainly meant the death penalty. However, Charles V's best efforts couldn't stop the rising tide of Protestantism. Soon, 70% of the people in his own Austrian territories declared themselves Protestant, and many states across the empire joined the faith. In 1548, Charlie issued the Augsburg Interim, attempting to begin the process of forcing those states back to Catholicism. The Protestant states of Germany didn't like that, and so in 1552, they went to war against Charles and defeated him. So the Habsburg family was forced to allow the individual rulers of each territory to decide which religion their people would be expected to follow. Humiliated by this defeat, Charles began to resign all of his posts, and by 1556 had surrendered all his remaining power to his family. His brother was given the Austrian lands and the Holy Roman Empire, and his son, Philip, King of Spain, was given Spain, the Italian territories, and the former Burgundian lands. Philip continued to milk the place for money to fund his wars against France. This upset a lot of the people who lived there. However, eventually he won the war with France, which allowed him to lower taxes again. But remember, Protestantism was still extremely popular in the provinces, and Philip had a very strict policy about non-Catholics. He declared that men who weren't Catholic should be killed with a sword or burned at the stake, and that women who weren't Catholic should be buried alive or burned at the stake. Inconveniently for Philip, however, his opinions about what to do with Protestants weren't popular among the local leaders. You see, it was easy for Philip to give these orders. He lived in Catholic Spain. If you killed every non-Catholic in Spain, well, that wouldn't be too difficult because there aren't that many non-Catholics in Spain. But if you killed every non-Catholic in the Low Countries, walking through the streets would get you knee-deep in blood. You'd have to expend vast government resources to wipe out a very large chunk of your country's population, which would obliterate the country's wealthy economy, wealth that Philip would need in any future war with France. Not to mention that if Protestants are such a high portion of your population that you need in your workforce, why would you want to alienate them? Why would you want to incentivize them to leave with policies that are fundamentally not going to succeed in killing every Protestant in the country? They're just going to succeed in making them angry. There's also the fact that killing thousands of people is evil and that you shouldn't do it, but nobody really cared about that at the time. The nobles of the Low Countries repeatedly tried to petition Philip and convince him that wiping out every single Jew, Protestant, Calvinist, Anabaptist, Mennonite and Lutheran in the Low Countries was not only not possible, but a terrible idea. But Philip wouldn't budge. That said, many of the local governments couldn't be bothered to obey Philip's demands, so they simply stopped prosecuting people for heresy. Holland stopped prosecuting heretics entirely in 1560. However, even before then, Amsterdam, for instance, hadn't awarded the death sentence to a Protestant for 7 years. Eventually, hundreds of nobles in the Low Countries, with an implied threat of revolution, managed to convince Philip's half-sister, Margaret, who was governor of the Low Countries, to cease the Inquisition until they heard back from Philip. Now, to be clear, there was literally a 0% chance that Philip's response was going to be anything except, what part of kill them all do you not understand? However, now that there was a temporary break in murdering everybody who didn't agree with the Pope, all the Protestants in the Low Countries suddenly did the one thing they'd been wanting to do for years. They all came out into the public arena and they started worshipping publicly and without fear for the first time in their entire lives. They began demanding churches of their own, at the expense of the Catholics, and Protestant rioters and militias began smashing up religious symbols, paintings, statues. Nothing was off limits. The Protestants must have felt like everything was going amazing, for the very short time that it lasted, because Philip was still Philip, and Philip flipped out when he heard the news, and he sent the Duke of Alba with 10,000 men to sort things out. And if you want an idea of what the Duke of Alba's mentality going into this was, allow me to read you a quote from one of the letters that he sent. It is infinitely better to keep, by means of war, forgotten for the king, an impoverished and even ruined country, than to keep it, without war, undamaged, for the devil and his partisans, the heretics. Well, thank God we've got you in charge, Mr. Alba. You'll keep the country safe. A mass exodus occurred as 50,000 people fled the Low Countries in preparation for the oncoming wave of suppression. Now, 50,000 people fleeing the Low Countries, let's put that in perspective here. At the time, about 3 million people lived in the Low Countries. So 50,000 people fleeing means that 1.6% of the people in the country fled. And they were right to be afraid. When the Duke of Alba arrived in the Low Countries, he had 9,000 people sentenced to death. That's 3 out of every 1,000 people. Fortunately, most of those people sentenced didn't end up dying. That's because it was one of those trials where they try you in the courtroom, but reach the verdict after you've gone home, giving you ample opportunity to escape, and escape they did. Of the 9,000 people that got sentenced, about 1,000 to 2,000 actually got executed. This wave of suppression happened in 1566, and one of those 50,000 people to flee the country was the Duke of Orange, a prominent Protestant nobleman. He fled to his allies in Germany, and in 1568, he returned with an army to drive out the Prince of Alba. This campaign was an absolute disaster. He suffered a series of defeats, that forced him and his allies to flee into exile. So, with Protestantism forced back underground and most of William's remaining forces in exile, things looked like they were going pretty alright for Philip. But then, now this is going to shock you, but the Duke of Alba absolutely hated heretics. But the one thing the Duke of Alba hated as much as he hated heretics was people from the Low Countries, which was why Philip of Spain decided to appoint Alba governor of the Low Countries in order to deal with the heretics. Now Alba had even less respect for the people and the customs and the laws of the Low Countries than Philip did. He didn't care about all those stupid rules about what the governor can and can't do. For example, because of the Great Privilege of 1477, the governor couldn't implement any taxes without the consent of the states. And when Alba was informed of that rule, his response was, "Thank you for informing me about that rule. Now you can inform me about the people that asked." And then he implemented a 5% tax on all real estate sales and a 10% tax on absolutely all other transactions. And would you believe me if I told you this international centre for commerce wasn't happy about that? So now Alba is disregarding the rights and the privileges of the states, implementing high taxes, and instituting a reign of terror. He was quite unpopular. Meanwhile, in England, some warships known as the Sea Beggars had been using England as a base in order to conduct their operations. These warships were fighting for William of Orange against the Spanish, and in 1572, Queen Elizabeth I of England decided to evict these warships from her ports. Looking around the place, these warships realised that now that they weren't allowed to harbour in England, they had only one place left to go. Straight back to the Netherlands. These warships went on a lightning campaign up and down Holland's rivers, swinging numerous cities to the side of the rebellion, and eventually declaring William of Orange the ruler of Holland. The cause against Habsburg rule in the Netherlands, which, such a short time ago, had seemed like it had been thrown into the dustbin of history, now was back, and stronger than ever before. This time, it looked like they might be able to drive the Spanish right back to Madrid. This is my impression of how Dutch soldiers used to dress in the 1700s, based on this image from 1778. There is Part 3, Revolution. The revolt swept across the country as numerous cities sided against the king, and the rebellion gained steam. But Philip wasn't done yet. Would it shock you to learn that the man whose policy towards people who disagreed with him was to brutally kill them all didn't feel like giving up without a fight? After all, why should he give up without a fight? He still has loads of cities on his side, notably Amsterdam, one of the most important cities in the country, still held out against the rebels in the heart of rebel territory. So, Spanish authorities launched a series of sieges to push the rebel lines back. If a city surrendered without a fight, the city would be spared. However, if a city chose to resist and then fell, that city would have horrible atrocities committed to it. This had an upside of making cities less likely to resist, however it had a downside of making cities basically never ever surrender once they'd started resisting, because they knew that if they ever surrendered, they were all going to die, or a lot of them anyway. One example was Limburg. Limburg was a city that spent over a month with almost no food holding out against the Spanish, while the Black Death ravaged their city's population, yet they still refused to surrender because surrendering meant a worse fate than what they were experiencing now. Luckily, the wind changed direction, allowing William of Orange to sail along the river and drive off the flooded Spanish forces. Apart from the fact that cities won't surrender, there is also another reason that you probably shouldn't sack almost every city you conquer. Sun Tzu wrote about this in his book. He said that the goal of warfare is to capture the enemy country as intact as possible, okay? The reason for this is because what is the point in conquering a city if you're just going to flatten it? Like, oh hooray, we conquered this pile of rocks? Great, let's enjoy the economic benefits of adding 5 boulders to our economy. You know, speaking of economics, you know that saying about not biting the hand that feeds you? Well, do you remember how Philip couldn't afford to fight his wars against France without help from the Netherlands? Well, if Philip can't afford to fight wars without money from the Netherlands, and now he's at war with the Netherlands, well, how does he pay for his wars? Exactly, he doesn't. The Netherlands was more than rich enough to pay for its own soldiers and hire mercenaries from Germany, Scotland, England and France in order to fight off the Spanish. Philip, on the other hand, couldn't afford to pay for all his soldiers. So, in Antwerp in 1575, a group of soldiers that hadn't been paid in 2 years mutinied and began looting the town, killing 7,000 civilians in the process. And all over the country, a similar thing was happening, as Spanish soldiers began mutinying and parading around the country in order to protest their not being paid. With foreign troops raging up and down the countries, even the loyalist states began to get quite annoyed with Philip. So the rebellious provinces and the loyalist provinces signed an agreement known as the Pacification of Ghent. The Pacification of Ghent was a defensive alliance between the loyalist states of the Low Countries and the rebellious states of the Low Countries. The goal was basically to stop Philip's armies from running up and down the country and burning everything to bits. So to be clear, the loyalist states were still loyal to Philip. They weren't declaring independence and they weren't declaring war on him. However, they were going to try and stop his armies from burning everything down. At this point, Philip must have wondered if his control of the Low Countries was slipping a bit. There was a massive rebellion going on against him, and even the supposedly loyal provinces were acting increasingly independently, signing deals with the rebels, and even deciding who got to become governor of the Low Countries, something that in theory only Philip should be able to do. However, Philip's luck would soon change. You see, the Pacification of Ghent was an alliance between a group of Protestant states and a group of Catholic states. And how long do you think an alliance like that can last in the 1500s, at the height of the Reformation? Well, exactly. The two sides began seizing each other's cities. Notably, Amsterdam fell to the rebels. There they began suppressing the rights of Catholics. And in 1578, William of Orange realised that trying to appeal to both sides got him nowhere, and so he declared himself an open Calvinist. In 1579, the Pacification of Ghent came to an end, and it was replaced by the unions of Arras and Utrecht. Arras was a union loyal to the king, and Utrecht was a union that was effectively a declaration of independence from Philip. Arras initially evicted Spanish troops from their soil before realising they needed Spain's help in order to crush the revolt. Finally, Philip could launch a new offensive, and slowly but surely, the line was being pushed northwards. He even managed to reopen the northern front, allowing him to attack the rebels from another angle. With Philip deposed and the Spanish advancing, William of Orange, leading the rebellion, desperately looked for another monarch in order to replace Philip. He looked to nobles from England and France, but every single monarch he tried, despite bringing in help from England and France respectively, just fell out of favour with the Dutch and had to be sent home. And with William's assassination in 1584, it looked like it was doomsday for the rebellion. However, Philip's luck would soon change. You see, he would soon entangle his resources in other wars that would draw his troops away from the Low Countries. He would send the Spanish Armada against England and intervene against the Protestant king in France. Now, you might remember that Philip can't afford to fight wars against France without help from the Netherlands. So how high do you think his chances of winning are if he's fighting a war against France without help from the Netherlands, while fighting 2 other wars against 2 other countries? Not high. He lost against France, lost against the English, and gave the Dutch a bit of breathing room to slow him down. Meanwhile, when William died, he was replaced by a son, Moritz, or Morris, depending on the source. Moritz continued work on a project his father had been doing, and that is training up the Dutch army into a professional fighting force capable of taking on any country in Europe. Instead of sending the troops home whenever they weren't needed on campaign, he would constantly drill them in order to train them up and turn them into a professionally trained army. And this plan worked. In the 1590s, the Dutch were able to win a series of victories against the Spanish, pushing them back. After that, a stalemate ensued. And so, in 1607, a ceasefire was signed, and in 1609, a truce was signed, designed to last for 12 years. It was at this point when Belgium and the Netherlands properly became 2 separate things. Up to this point, the Low Countries had all been ruled by one person and one country. However, the Low Countries had now been divided into the Dutch Republic and the Hapsburg Netherlands. Sure, the word Belgium didn't exist yet. However, politically dividing the Low Countries in 2 like this was the moment when the northern Low Countries and the southern Low Countries went their separate ways. They now had a different history, a different culture, and a different economy. So how is each economy doing? Well, The southern economy had been ruined by the war. They had lost at least 50% of their population. That's the product of spending several decades on the front line of a ruthless war in which fallen cities are often sacked. The north, on the other hand, had most of their population concentrated in Holland, and Holland had never really been on the front lines of the war properly. This meant that the northern population and economy hadn't been too heavily damaged by the war, at least not nearly as much as the Habsburg Netherlands. This set the stage for the Dutch to begin a humongous economic boom that would propel them to the forefront of international commerce and make them one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Part 4, the Golden Age. Between the 1580s and the 1660s, the Dutch Republic experienced exponential economic growth, taking it to the position of the wealthiest place in Europe and the financial centre of the world. They held the largest linen and wool production centres in Europe. They dominated the spice, cod, cheese, herring, pepper, butter, opium and clove trade. They got big into trading pottery, slaves, whales, beef, coffee, salt and silk. They were the only foreign power allowed to trade with Japan, with which they traded gold, silver, lacquerware, cartography, beer and steamships. One of their biggest trade competitors was England, but one of their biggest victims was the Portuguese. All over the world, Dutch ships seized Portuguese colonies. When they occupied Brazil in 1630, they monopolised Europe's sugar supply in a single stroke. Danzig was the largest port in the Baltic Sea, and 80% of the trade in and out of that port was managed by the Dutch. In 1650, 60% of the trade in the Baltic was managed by the Netherlands. Not only that, but higher wages in the Dutch Republic brought in hordes of immigrants with marketable skills, from places like Antwerp to places like Amsterdam, whose population more than tripled from 1570 to 1622. All this immigration boosted the country's economy even more, and soon enough, about half the Dutch labour force was made up of immigrants. The arts also began to flourish. The country got some of its first universities. In fact, 50% of all books published in Europe were published in the Netherlands. So things in the Netherlands were going pretty well right now. But do you know what else is going well? Human rights. Just a disclaimer, I am going to be talking about what life was like in the Dutch Republic at the time. Obviously, I'm generalising here. It's going to be different with each specific place, but on average, this is roughly what life was like in the Dutch Republic. At the time, the human rights situation in the Netherlands, while being absolutely appalling by today's standards, was pretty good for the time. For example, freedom of religion. So those of you who've been paying attention will know that at the time, being persecuted for your religion was pretty common, and the Netherlands was also willing to persecute people on religious grounds. The only people allowed to hold public office were those who signed up to the Calvinist Reformed Church. What this meant was that only 1/6 of the population were actually able to hold public office. But that didn't mean religious freedom was non-existent. That meant that everybody was free to practice their religion privately, but only Calvinists could worship in public. Although if you were rich enough, you could pay off the local sheriff, and he could then let you worship publicly and not be a snitch. Now, having to bribe the local sheriff in order to not get persecuted for worshipping publicly is pretty terrible, just objectively. However, for the time, that was actually better than quite a lot of places. There also wasn't too much bad blood between people of different religions. Pretty much everybody worked with or traded with someone of a different religion, be it Jewish, Lutheran, Calvinist, Catholic, anything, Mennonite. Of course, this was the 1600s, so there was going to be some limit to religious tolerance. You would pretty much never marry somebody of a different religion, and there was one group of people that was pretty consistently denied the right to live in pretty much every town they showed up at, and that was the Gypsies. Speaking of tolerating other people's ideas, another human rights issue that was going quite well was free speech. Descartes, the I think therefore I am guy, spent most of his career in the Netherlands because that was the place with the best free speech laws. That said, free speech was far from perfect. Remember, this was still the country where only Calvinists could hold public office, but for the time, it was pretty good. Another human right that was pretty good for the time, but still bad, was women's rights. Women at the time were highly literate and would often take over the businesses of a male relative when he died. Marriage was supposed to be a consenting and loveful thing between two equal parties, And Miss Sherman, one of the first women in European history to go to university, went to uni in the Netherlands. Miss Sherman was extremely intelligent. She could speak 14 languages. 14! And she would go on to write numerous books. In one of those books, she would argue that men and women were equally capable of academic and literary achievement, which at the time was an extremely hot take. But, say it with me now, 1600s! Exactly, and so there were going to be flaws. First of all, most of the businesses run by women involved caring for people. Second of all, Sherman wasn't allowed to actually get a degree at the university. She was allowed to attend the lectures, and that was it. Also, I guess they considered it, inappropriate or something for men and women to work hand in hand, or whatever, because Sherman was only allowed to listen to the lectures if she listened to them from behind a curtain or a screen so nobody could see her. Now, I don't want to praise the Dutch too much, because while there were things they were doing that were better than the standard at the time, there were also some things they did that were abhorrent even by the standards of the day. For example, slavery. Whenever the Dutch abducted a group of people from West Africa and took them to the Americas to be enslaved, 11% of those African people would die on the boat on the way to the Americas. That's how bad it was. I also want to stress that just because the economy was doing well in the Netherlands, that doesn't mean life was easy. For example, there was a lot of food, you weren't going to go hungry, however, that food was neither nutritious nor tasty. Additionally, if you wanted to get that food, men, women and children alike all had to engage in hard labour all day, every day. The child mortality rate was also so high that a majority of children did not survive till adulthood. Let me ask you this, how many children were there in your house when you grew up, okay? There was 3 children, alright, let's say there were 3 children in your household growing up. That means you got you, one of your siblings, and then another one of your siblings. Great. Now visualise all 3 of you standing there in a room together. Well, statistically, if you 3 had grown up in the Dutch Republic, 2 of you would not have survived until the age of 18. But wait, why was the death rate so high? Well, because of a little something called the Black Death. Every 10 to 20 years, the Black Plague would hit the country, and whenever the plague struck, an individual town might lose 15 to 20% of its population. So, for simplicity's sake, let's say the Black Death hits every 15 years, and every time that happens, you have a 1 in 6 chance of dying. Under that equation, there is a 50% chance that the Black Death kills you before the age of 45. So if the Black Death was the only possible thing in existence that could ever kill you, then there was a 50% chance of you living till 45. But the Black Death isn't the only thing that can kill you, and so there is a higher than 50% chance of you dying before the age of 45. Additionally, most people were quite poor. Even in the wealthiest places, 80 to 85% of people in each town would usually be in poverty or quite close to being in poverty. So what I'm saying here is that while things in the Netherlands were going well, they were far from perfect. Speaking of, how are things going in politics? Let's talk politics about the Netherlands for a bit. So at the time, the standard Calvinist teaching was that before you were born, God had already decided whether or not you would go to heaven or you would go to hell. But then there came along a group of people called the Remonstrants. The Remonstrants believed that human choice had a say in the matter, okay? Your choices of whether or not you wanted to sin would decide, partially at least, whether or not you were going to go to heaven or hell. The Remonstrants, in general, wanted to seek closer relations with Catholic France and renew the truce with Spain. But there were people who disagreed with them. These people were called the Contramonstrants. These people disagreed with any attempts to be friends with the Catholics, and they believed they could grow the economy and expand their trade by renewing the war with Spain. In 1619, Moritz, a leading Contramonstrants, led a coup against the Remonstrants and did a purge of the government. Oldenbarnevelt, the leading Remonstrant in the country, was executed. However, Moritz didn't really gain much power from this coup, because he was already effectively the leader of the country, and Remonstrant churches continued to openly practice all throughout the country. In 1621, after another failed round of negotiations, the war with Spain restarted. Now, at first, the war with Spain was quite slow and unenthusiastic between the two sides. However, by 1624, things had kicked off again in full force. Spanish forces were gradually taking more and more land, and, contrary to the expectations of the Contramonstrants, the Spanish blockades were hurting the Dutch economy. But after 1625, Dutch fortunes began to turn. for a few reasons. First of all, in 1628, they managed to capture a Spanish silver fleet, which denied a lot of pay to the Spanish army. The Spanish lost so much money in the capture of their silver fleet that it virtually paralysed their divisions in Flanders. And the Dutch captured so much money from that fleet that it took an entire week to load all that silver onto the Dutch ships. Second of all, in 1625, Moritz died. The man was replaced by a guy named Frederick Henry. Frederick was a military genius and began to push the Spanish back. And thirdly, the other wars being fought in Europe hindered Spain's military capacity. In 1630, Sweden launched an invasion of the Holy Roman Emperor, and allied with or occupied most of the land in modern-day Germany. Luckily for Spain, a combined Spanish-Austrian force was able to defeat the combined Swedish-German force at the Battle of Nordlingen, pushing the Swedish back all the way to the coast. But just when it looked like everything was going well for the Habsburg family, France declared war on Spain, which put France, Sweden and the Netherlands at war with Spain, Bavaria and Austria. Now those of you with eyes that are good enough to read a map will be able to see that the Spanish territories in the Netherlands were separated from Spain, meaning the only way Spain could continue to fight the war against France and the Netherlands would be to continue sending supplies overseas to the Netherlands. Cardinal Richelieu, Foreign Minister of France, knew that if he wanted to win this war, he was going to have to cut the Spanish supply lines to the Netherlands. A combined Dutch-French force invaded the Spanish Netherlands. Unfortunately, the people who lived in the territory they were trying to invade didn't like the Dutch or the French, and so the invasion failed. Additionally, the Spanish defeated the French in Italy and launched an invasion going straight for Paris. However, fortunes changed, and the Spanish advance was stopped and turned back before it even reached Paris. And this was the moment when the military situation began to go well for the French. You see, Spain's main advantage over France was her naval dominance. The French navy had been much less strong than the Spanish one, but Richelieu had been trying to change that. Over the past few years, he'd been building up the French navy, and now he believed it was strong enough to cut the Spanish supply lines. In 1639, a combined Dutch-French force completely froze all Spanish movement through the English Channel. In the Mediterranean, French ships began attacking Spanish ships on the way to Italy. Meanwhile, Savoy and Alsace-Lorraine fell to the French, cutting off the Spanish supply lines to Belgium. Finally, Sweden conquered the Upper Rhine, entirely encircling the Spanish Netherlands between Sweden, France, and the Netherlands. All communication between Brussels and Madrid was cut off. In 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia brought peace to Bavaria, Austria, Sweden, and the Netherlands. However, France and Spain would remain at war until 1659. The treaty would force the Dutch to give Catholics a lot more religious freedom than they'd been previously doing, but it also made the Spanish recognise their independence and allowed the Dutch to trade basically as much as they wanted, so what more could they have asked for from a peace treaty? For now, the Dutch would continue to see massive economic growth unlike anything they'd ever seen before, well into the 50s and the 60s. However, all good things must come to an end, because the English didn't like how the Dutch were eating up such a large share of the global economy. They wanted some of that for themselves. So the growing English and later British Empire would go on to displace the Dutch and take their place as the global economic hegemon. Part 5. Decline. Here's a fun fact about the Dutch Golden Age. The Dutch were so economically powerful that even the Spanish, their former colonial overlord who was fighting a war of independence against them, had to eventually lift their embargo against the Dutch in the 1590s. At this point, I'm going to take a minute to explain something that I was going to have to explain eventually, okay? And that is how the Dutch government worked. You're going to have to understand this if you want to be able to understand the rest of the video, in my opinion. So first of all, I have to say that the Dutch Republic was not a republic in the way we think of the word today. I call it a republic in this video because that was its name and everybody else calls it a republic. However, it was only a republic in the sense that it didn't have a king. And it only didn't have a king in the sense that the king's name wasn't the king. There were no elections in the republic, and pretty much nobody was advocating for anything resembling what we would call democracy today. Instead, people in positions of power chose who got to be in other positions of power. They actually had the same problem in San Marino, where for 300 years, the governing council of San Marino appointed its own members, and that meant the same families were appointing each other again and again and again, and it was eventually just a few key families who all run the entire country. Well, that's also what happened in the Netherlands, okay? The people in charge chose who else got to be in charge, and so it was just the same people and the same families appointing each other again and again and again. The name for this is an oligarchy. I mentioned earlier that the Republic was run by somebody who was very similar to a king, but wasn't called a king, and that person was called the Stadtholder. You see, the Republic was made up of 7 different states. There were a few other territories in the country, the same way the United States has 50 states in the country. However, there are a few places like Puerto Rico and DC that aren't part of one of the 50 states, but they are part of the USA. The Netherlands was a bit like that. Each of these states was run by a Stadtholder. The Stadtholder was chosen by the state government, and in theory, they could choose whoever they liked to be the Stadtholder. However, in practice, it was a hereditary position. Most of the states always chose the same Stadtholder, and that Stadtholder was almost always the son of the last person to be the Stadtholder. But remember, the states could, and sometimes did, choose somebody else to be the Stadtholder. For example, the state of Friesland almost always chose somebody from the House of Nassau to be their Stadtholder. The Republic also had a federal government. We call it the States General. Now remember, the States General that ran the Republic was not the same States General as the States General founded by Philip of Burgundy hundreds of years earlier. It was a new States General founded during the Dutch War of Independence. The states had representation in the States General. However, some of the territorial subdivisions within the states also had a representation within the States General. We can't know for sure because not all information survives the test of time, some of it gets lost to history. However, it was estimated that about 50 different territorial subdivisions had representation within the States General. Something to stress is that the Stadtholder, from the very beginning to the very end of the Republic, never ever had as much power as your typical king would have had. However, there is the argument, especially towards the end of the Republic when he started gaining a lot of power, that he was functionally a king. However, it's worth noting that sometimes the states would choose not to appoint a Stadtholder at all, and instead the position would be left vacant. But wait a minute, if the position of Stadtholder was left vacant, who would be in charge of the Republic? Well, allow me to introduce you to a man named the Grand Pensionary. The Grand Pensionary was the title of a very important civil servant in the government of Holland. You see, the majority of the Republic's population lived in the state of Holland. Fun fact, 58% of the government budget was contributed by the state of Holland, and even then, Holland was probably underpaying relative to their share of the population. Basically, Holland was the most powerful state. Whoever was in charge of Holland was in charge of the Republic. And if the position of Stadtholder was ever left vacant, which it sometimes was, then the Grand Pensionary, that is, the most important civil servant in Holland, would be left as the de facto ruler of the Republic. And that is how the government of the Dutch Republic worked. See, that wasn't so bad, was it? But why am I explaining all of this to you? Well, in 1650, the Stadtholder of most of the states in the Netherlands died. Friesland would continue to be ruled by the House of Nassau, but all the rest of the states chose not to appoint a new Stadtholder and just leave the position vacant, leaving the Grand Pensionary of Holland, Johan de Witt, in charge. Meanwhile, England had also recently overthrown their king, and they had replaced him with a man who absolutely was not a king, but he was going to rule the country for the rest of his life, and when he died, his son was going to take over. But he was not a king, goddammit, he was not a king! England proposed a political union with the Netherlands, who said no. But hurt at this rejection, the English began attacking Dutch shipping. This made the two sides angry at each other, tensions escalated, and in 1652, a war began. Unfortunately for the Dutch, the English ships were bigger and better than theirs. One Dutch ship in a fair fight against an English ship would lose every time. You'd think then that the Dutch wouldn't be able to win many victories over the English, but you'd be wrong. Despite having lower quality ships, the Dutch Navy was soon able to batter the English fleet and drive them out of the Baltic and the Mediterranean. Closer to home, in the North Sea, the Dutch had much less success. They were defeated and driven back by the English, who began blockading large parts of their coast, hindering their trade as the Dutch economy entered freefall. The Dutch knew they had to get rid of that blockade, so they marshalled the largest fleet they could, well over 100 warships, and they met the English at the Battle of Scheveningen. Unfortunately, the Dutch were still way outmatched. they were sent fleeing the scene after a very significant portion of their fleet was wiped out. The battle was an English tactical victory, but it would be a Dutch strategic victory, because the English also suffered heavy losses in the battle. These losses caused the English to break off their attack on the Dutch and return back home. So with that, the Dutch Republic was saved. A peace treaty was signed, and they could continue trading again. And the Dutch continued to trade. I've mentioned this a couple of times before, but during the 50s and 60s, their trade would continue to balloon as the Dutch Republic reached the height of its power. Of course, there were some failures. For example, remember how I mentioned earlier that they'd been fighting the Portuguese a bit, seizing Portuguese colonies? Well, they signed a peace treaty with the Portuguese, and they had to give Brazil back to them. Oh well. However, there were also a lot of successes. For example, not wanting to lose another battle to the English, the Grand Pensionary, Johan de Witt, commissioned 120 new warships in order to defend their shores. And this fleet proved its mettle in the Battle of Copenhagen, when in 1658 the Swedish decided they wanted to take over the entire Baltic Sea. So they laid siege to Copenhagen and began to assault the city. But never fear, the Dutch are here. And the Dutch know that if Copenhagen falls and the Swedish take over the entire Baltic Sea, that would harm their trade in the region. And so they have to save Copenhagen. The Dutch fleet takes on the Swedish navy outside of Copenhagen and handily defeats them, causing Swedish to break off their attack on the city and saving Denmark. However, in the 1660s, something strange began to happen. And began strange, I mean the English continued to attack Dutch shipping, and they even seized New Amsterdam from the English. This couldn't be allowed to stand. And so, in 1665, war was declared and the fight was back on for round 2. At this point, the Dutch ships were bigger and better than they had been in the last war, so surely this time they could pull off a victory against the English? Well, unfortunately for the Dutch, the English ships were even bigger and even better than they had been in the last war, and so they began to absolutely rinse the Dutch at sea. On one occasion, 150 Dutch ships anchored at port, which by the way was more ships than the Dutch had at Scheveningen, was ambushed, and the entire fleet was burned. Simultaneously, the German state of Munster invaded the Republic and took over large swaths of land. For the second time in less than 15 years, it seemed like the ground was collapsing beneath the feet of the Dutch Republic. However, the tide would soon turn against the English. You see, 6,000 French troops came along and kicked the Munsterites out of the Republic. Hooray! Meanwhile, at sea, the Dutch fleet was able to inflict just enough damage on the English that the fleet had to return to port for repairs. Ordinarily, this wouldn't have been a problem. The English could just repair their fleet and go back to mincing the Dutch at sea. But on this occasion, the English had recently been suffering some bad luck. For example, the Great Plague of London and the Great Fire of London had just hit the city. That, combined with a bunch of other things, meant that the only thing more broke than the English fleet was the English purse. And so, the English king simply couldn't afford to repair his fleet. And so, his navy was grounded. The Dutch Republic was safe. Capitalising on this glorious victory, the Dutch pensionary ordered an attack on the English fleet anchored in harbour. The attack was a huge success. They sunk 3 huge English warships, and they even managed to kidnap the English flagship and tow it all the way back to the Netherlands. The English signed a peace treaty, and the war was over. After surviving 2 wars with the English against the odds, the Dutch now saw a new threat rise to face them: France. You see, previously, the Habsburg Netherlands, controlled by Spain, had been the single greatest threat to Dutch power. But now, the Dutch didn't really view them as a threat anymore. Instead, they viewed them as a valuable buffer state to protect them against the expansionist desires of France. Meanwhile, do you remember how earlier 2 states in the Dutch Republic were rescued from attackers by France? And because of that, the people who lived in those states now began to wonder if they'd be better off as a part of France. And so it was very crucial that the French also didn't start to wonder if those states would be better off as a part of France, or those states probably really would become a part of France. And that now looked increasingly likely because France began trying to expand into the Habsburg Netherlands. This terrified the Dutch, so they entered a 3-country alliance with Sweden and England to try and pressure the French into backing down and withdrawing from the Habsburg Netherlands. This plan didn't work. France paid off Sweden to leave the alliance and convinced England to switch sides. And now the French are extremely angry with the Netherlands. They had just saved the Netherlands from a Munsterite invasion, and now the Netherlands was turning against them? So now France is furious in the Netherlands. And England also doesn't like the Netherlands because they just fought 2 wars against them. And Munster also really wants to take over those parts of the Netherlands. And Cologne is also friends with France. So now you've got 4 countries who all want to defeat the Netherlands. Wow, I'm sure this situation won't cause anybody to die. The Dutch didn't really expect another war to happen for quite some time, so they had been downsizing their military over the last few years. Eventually, the Republic did realise that a French attack was coming, and so for a few months before the war started, they began trying to rapidly build up their military again, but it wasn't enough. In 1672, 4 countries declared war on the Netherlands and began their invasion. This year, 1672, is generally considered to be the year when the Dutch Golden Age came to an end. French forces launched themselves along the line and assaulted the Dutch forts along the river. These forts were designed to hold out against the French for several weeks. Instead, they fell in a matter of days. With the first line of forts defeated, the French plundered their way across the country, looting town after town after town. Meanwhile, Munster besieged the city of Groningen. France's goal here was very clear. They wanted to bring the Dutch Republic to an end, and it looked increasingly like they might be able to do that because they were coming up on the last line of defence, the line of fortifications that protected Zeeland and Holland from invaders. And this was crucial because, remember, most of the people lived in Holland, so if Holland fell, then so would the Republic. But the Republic hadn't had time to get its defences up yet, and so the line was severely underdefended. If the French attacked now, they would break through the line and the Republic would fall. Hello everybody, when I filmed that part of the video, there were a few things that I didn't realise about the Dutch defensive line, and those are some things that I want to tell you now, because they're very interesting. So let's go. You know how the Low Countries are largely below sea level? That's why we call them the Low Countries. Well, that actually gives them a great advantage because it means they can flood large parts of the country whenever they want, and that is a very good defence mechanism. For example, during the Dutch War of Independence against the Spanish, whenever the Spanish would besiege a city, the relief force would simply flood the dams near the city and flood the Spanish position, driving off the invading army. It actually worked quite well, and the most interesting one of these flood-based defences that I want to talk about is called the Old Dutch Waterline, or the Holland Waterline, or whatever you want to call it, and it's exactly what it sounds like, okay? It's a series of dams, waterworks, and reservoirs that could, at any moment, be flooded and engulf a large strip of land between Zeeland and Amsterdam in water, very nearly turning Holland into an island. These waterworks were only ever engaged once, and that was in 1672, when France invaded. Fun fact, these waterworks weren't fully prepared when the French arrived, and that's because the local farmers, who didn't want their land to get flooded, began sabotaging the waterworks in order to make it harder to flood them, and that was one of many things that delayed the Dutch efforts to flood half the country in order to stop the French. You might be thinking, Ben, surely the French could just get a bunch of boats and sail across the water. No, they couldn't, because the Dutch were very clever and designed it so that the water was shallow enough that most boats couldn't sail across it, but deep enough that their flat-bottomed boats could sail across it, which is very, very clever. Centuries later, these waterworks would be expanded to protect Utrecht as well, and they were last used in 1940 against Germany. Unfortunately for the Dutch, do you remember how I said these waterworks could turn Holland into almost an island? Yeah, almost an island, but not entirely an island, and that allowed the German troops to simply outflank the line by going around the south, which is the same thing they'd done with the Maginot Line. Construction, modernisation and development projects along these water defensive works continued into the post-World War II era. However, in the early 1960s, the main waterline that could defend Holland against invaders was decommissioned and was no longer used for military purposes. There were other waterworks that were, in theory, designed to defend against a possible Soviet invasion. However, they were never tested, and in 1968, the last Dutch defensive waterworks were decommissioned. Of course, they still exist, and you can go and visit them if you want. They're a UN World Heritage Site, but they probably aren't going to use those waterworks as defensive structures again. But the Republic hadn't had time to get its defences up yet, and so the line was severely underdefended. If the French attacked now, they would break through the line, and the Republic would fall. Instead, the French made one crucial mistake that would save the Republic from certain doom. They hesitated. They hesitated for just 1 second too long, and that allowed the Dutch to get their defences up along the line. You see, the plan had been for the navies to defeat the Dutch at sea, allowing the English to land troops on Dutch soil and attack the line from the other side. And so the French halted the attack and consolidated their position, allowing the Dutch to reinforce their last line of defence. Meanwhile, Holland was freaking out. In pretty much every war they'd ever fought, they'd never really been on the front line of that war. Suddenly, this war was real for them, and they were panicking. Who could possibly be to blame for this awful defeat? People began to declare that the only possible explanation was either incompetence by the current government, or more likely, treachery. And so, angry mobs began to protest the Dutch government, and soon the Grand Pensionary Johan de Witt was overthrown. The protesters even ate parts of his body. All over the country, protesters forced Johan's supporters to resign, and they replaced him with Orangist supporters. You see, do you remember how the House of Orange used to be the stadtholder of the Republic? Well, the son of the Prince of Orange was still alive, and he really wanted to be made stadtholder. Earlier that year, Johan de Witt had appointed him head of the army, so you'd think any blame for losing a war would fall on the House of Orange, right? Because they were in charge of the army. Well, apparently not. Instead, the rebels installed the House of Orange as stadtholder of most of the states. And with that, the monarchy was back. At sea, a combined French and English fleet lost a series of disastrous defeats against the Dutch navy, causing England to withdraw from the war. Meanwhile, further north, the Munsterite attack failed, and they had to withdraw. That left only Cologne and France at war with the Netherlands. But luckily, the Holy Roman Empire and Spain would come to the rescue of the Netherlands. A combined Imperial Dutch force invaded Cologne and took the city of Bonn. This city was the main French supply depot in the region. Now that Bonn had fallen, France couldn't maintain her invasion of the Netherlands, and in 1674, France had to withdraw. The war would continue for several more years before in 1678, the Netherlands signed a peace treaty, and peace was restored. After the war with France, the Dutch economy began to recover, and they were still a global economic force. However, it just wasn't the same after that. Do you remember how I said 60% of the trade in the Baltic was handled by the Dutch? Well, by 1690, that number was down to just 47%. Still a lot, but still nowhere near what it had been. The Dutch also had to spend more of their resources on another precious war with France, when a coalition of some of the most powerful countries in Europe went to war against the French to stop their expansion into the Habsburg Netherlands, only for it to end in another goddamn draw. The Habsburg Netherlands couldn't even manage their own defence anymore, meaning the Dutch Republic had to send their own troops down south in order to guard the territory against the French. Of course, there were still successes. Between the 1680s and the 1720s, the Dutch East India Company doubled in size, and the stadtholder even got himself made King of England, Scotland, and Ireland for several years. Then the stadtholder died, and the two countries went their separate ways again. But it was clear the Republic was no longer a great power. In the Spanish War of Succession, in which the Austrians were able to take control of the Habsburg Netherlands, the Dutch Republic was sidelined in negotiations. Worse, the war had been funded by loans. Loans that were becoming increasingly high. In 40 years, the national debt had doubled to 200 million guilders. It got to the point where the only way the government could get people to invest anymore was to set up a lottery to fund the conflict. After the Spanish War of Succession, 60% of the government budget had to go towards servicing the debt. And even then, they defaulted on their loans in 1715. This once great republic had been relegated to the second or even third rank of European power. Many of the people in the country must be wondering if their republic had hit rock bottom. But here's the interesting thing about rock bottom. It doesn't exist. Part 6, it got worse. In 1702, the stadtholder died, and the states opted not to replace him, leaving the Grand Pensionary as the de facto leader. How did the stadtholder return again? The exact same way he returned last time. In 1740, a woman became the ruler of Austria, and I think you know what that means. France invaded the Netherlands, who had the same song and dance as they did during the last French invasion. They blamed the government for letting them get invaded, and were aware that their ancestors had lived better lives than them. Many people believed that bringing back the stadtholder would restore the Golden Age, so they overthrew the government and installed the stadtholder. William IV was the first stadtholder to rule all 7 of the states within the Netherlands, making him the most powerful stadtholder ever. On top of that, the stadtholder was made a hereditary position, so now when the stadtholder died, the states wouldn't have a choice whether or not they wanted to appoint somebody different this time from a different family, or whether or not they even wanted to have a stadtholder at all. They would always have to appoint the son of the last stadtholder. If the position of stadtholder wasn't already effectively a king, it probably was now. Although it's worth noting, the stadtholder still didn't have as much power as your typical king would have had. So what reforms did William make to bring the Dutch back to their golden age? That was why he was put into power, was it not? Well, not many. At one point, riots broke out in which private tax collectors had their homes looted and burned, and their bodies beaten the heck out of, which ended up inspiring William to ban private tax collectors, which actually ended up costing the people of the Netherlands more money than they were paying previously. And apart from that, that was it. He didn't really implement any other major reforms. Not that I'm blaming him that much. Nobody could have brought the Dutch Republic realistically back to the Golden Age. The Dutch harbours weren't large enough anymore to house the ginormous warships fielded by the French and the English. The massive decrease in Dutch power would be demonstrated during the next war with England. In 1776, the Dutch governor of a Caribbean colony gave a gun salute to a nearby American warship. This is considered the first international recognition of American independence. The island in question was a crucial base for Dutch merchants to supply ammo to the American Revolution. The ammo was absolutely vital for getting American independence from the British. See, America got independence from the British with the help of France and Spain. But America declared independence in 1776, the war began in 1775, and yet France only joined in 1777, and Spain didn't join until much later than that. So, prior to 1777, who was it that was supplying the Americans with the ammo they needed to fight off the British? Well, it was the Dutch. Additionally, when the Founding Fathers were creating their ideals for the USA, they actually took quite a lot of inspiration from the Dutch Revolt centuries prior. And that makes a lot of sense. The French Revolution and most of the Atlantic revolutions hadn't happened yet. There weren't many examples of liberal revolutions to draw from in order to get any ideals. I guess there was the English Civil War and the Neapolitan Revolt of 1647, and apart from that, I can't really think of any other examples apart from the Dutch Revolt, and that's why the American system of government ended up being surprisingly similar to the Dutch system of government. And I'll give you 3 guesses who wasn't happy about that. The Dutch stadtholder hadn't wanted to go to war against the English, but he couldn't really stop his merchants from selling ammo to the Americans. So, in 1780, the British declared war on him, and it was war. Let's put this in perspective for a second. In the first war against the English, over 100 years earlier, the Dutch had defeated the English in the Med, defeated the English in the Baltic, and broken the English blockade of their country. In the second war against the English, the Dutch had pushed the enemy fleet back to port, launched an attack on the enemy fleet in port, and kidnapped their flagship. In the third war against the English, when the Dutch were fighting both the English and the French at sea, the Dutch had defeated both of their enemies at sea and temporarily retaken New York from the English. So, now that the Dutch have lost a lot of power, how well do you think they're going to fare in the fourth war against the English? Extremely poorly. The English declared war against the Dutch near the end of 1780. In 1780, the Dutch had 2,000 ships managing trade in the Baltic Sea. The English declared war on the Dutch right at the end of 1780. By 1781, the Dutch had 11 ships managing trade in the Baltic Sea. All over the planet, Dutch commerce and colonies were attacked by the British and seized, as the English Empire picked apart the Dutch economy piece by piece. The war bullying spree ended in 1784 as the American colonies got their independence, leaving the Dutch state severely weakened. You're welcome, buddy. But wait a minute, the Americans are working to set up their democracy across the pond, and they've just overthrown their king. Why can't we overthrow our equivalent of a king? Said many of the Dutch. So, with everything going terribly for the Republic, and the stadtholder working to increase his influence, many people began to get angry. So, during 1780 and going until 1787, a movement called the Patriot movement came about. The Patriot movement wanted to remove the stadtholder from power and create a representative democracy in the Netherlands. The Patriots began circulating petitions with thousands of signatures on them. They began setting up committees to coordinate opposition to the government, organising militias to defend their movement from counter-revolution, and holding protests outside of government buildings to force local governments to resign and install their own representatives. Over a couple of years, the stadtholder's power gradually diminished. In some places, they even began writing the stadtholder out of the constitution, and soon enough, parts of the Netherlands even began planning on holding general and democratic elections for the local governments. At the height of the revolt in 1787, a massive crowd stormed the government building in Holland and forced the government there to begin preparing to install a representative democracy. In Holland, the stadtholder's influence almost entirely vanished. However, there are always drawbacks. The rebels were extremely divided amongst each other about what they actually wanted when the stadtholder was gone. For example, in the town of Deventer, the guild workers felt the new constitution didn't represent their interests enough, so many of the guild workers defected and joined the Orangist cause. The King of Prussia understood the concept of, it could happen here. If the Dutch people could overthrow their king, or equivalent of, with so little effort and so little violence, that set the precedent that every country in Europe could overthrow their king with very little violence. And the Prussian king didn't want to be overthrown by his peasants. It also helped that the stadtholder's wife was the Prussian king's sister. Those reasons combined caused the Prussian king to send in the troops, and 20,000 of the best Prussian soldiers suppressed the Patriot militias with very little difficulty. The remaining Patriots fled to France, and the Enlightenment Revolution in the Netherlands seemed to be at an end. The cause for democracy was over. Or was it? Because in 1789, the French began to take power away from the king and transfer it to their people. In 1792, the French Wars of Revolution began, and pretty much all of Western Europe got sucked into the conflict. Ordinarily, this wouldn't be a problem, as the Netherlands was protected by rivers, and, like I mentioned earlier, waterworks that kept the invaders out. But in the winter of 1794 to 1795, the weather got so cold that this year, the rivers did something they didn't normally do. They froze, leaving the country open to invasion. French troops stormed into the country. The Dutch Republic was a country that had spent 80 years fighting off the most powerful nation on earth, beat back not 2, but 3 offensives from foreign countries that should have brought it to an end, and expanded across the globe and conquered a colossal trading empire. You'd think then that the Republic would be entitled by history to a glorious end, in which they fought back to the last against the French. But when it came to it, this 200-year-old Republic was well past its glory days, and it fell without much resistance. Seeing the writing on the wall, Stadtholder William V fled to England in a fishing boat, while Dutch revolutionaries overthrew his regime in a largely bloodless coup, and got to work attempting to create a free and fair society based on Enlightenment ideals. French troops marched through the streets to scenes of thunderous applause. Suddenly, for the first time in a long time, people felt they could be optimistic about something. The stadtholder was gone, a new regime was in place. Surely, now was the moment things could get better. Part 7. Aftermath of the Republic. Soon enough, the optimistic excitement of revolution gave way to the sobering reality of politics. The stadtholder's regime was replaced with the Batavian Republic, named after the Batavian people who had lived in the Netherlands thousands of years prior, and staged a revolt against the Roman Empire, before possibly leaving the region. They were viewed as the ancestors to the modern Dutch people. With the stadtholder gone, the Batavian Republic would be left to make peace with France, and this would be a harrowing peace. Not only would the Batavian Republic have to pay 100 million guilders in reparations to the French, but also they would have to be occupied by 25,000 French soldiers, and the Republic would have to pay the cost of maintaining that army. Signed in May 1795, the Treaty of The Hague left the Dutch state with the sudden need to conjure up 320 million guilders worth of revenue overnight. And if you want an idea of how much that kind of money would be worth to the Dutch state at the time, the national debt in 1795 was already 455 million guilders. Their Dutch still did make some money from their colonial empire. However, the British got permission from the exiled Dutch stadtholder to occupy the Dutch Empire. The British not only occupied the Dutch Empire, but also dismantled the Dutch East India Company, transferring all 120 million guilders worth of debt held by the Dutch East India Company to the Dutch state. French domination was a time of economic hardship for the Netherlands. While the more rural eastern territories saw economic growth during this time, the more urbanised and heavily populated western parts of the country saw economic decline. Taxes had to increase to pay their money that they owed to the French, but also trade was decreasing. For hundreds of years, churches had provided an important source of relief for the poor of the country, helping them out when times got rough. But the churches also saw their budgets decrease, limiting their ability to help the poor. So economically, things weren't going too well for the country, but politically, things weren't going much better. The Batavian Republic was a democracy in which all men over 20 could vote, provided they didn't support the House of Orange and that they didn't subsist on poor relief. It was also the first place in Europe to allow Jews the chance to join the government. However, there were a lot of problems. Political deadlock made it damn near impossible to get anything done. In 1797, after 2 years of deliberation, the constitution was put forward to be voted on by the people of the country. But the constitution was rejected on the grounds that it didn't go far enough. In January 1798, the French government sponsored a coup by the radicals of the country, who seized control of the government. They implemented their own constitution and put that forward for a national referendum. Only this time, if you wanted to vote on whether or not you liked the constitution, you first had to denounce the political enemies of the radicals. This caused the constitution to pass on a landslide. The unpopular radicals were overthrown in another coup that summer, however their constitution would remain in place. At this point, just over 3 years after everything seemed like it was going well, everybody was just checked out of politics. I mean, nothing was going to improve anymore. National debt was soaring and the Republic was about as stable as a spinning plate, evidenced by the fact that between 1798 and 1815, the Republic went through no less than 7 constitutions. And so everybody stopped caring about politics anymore because they didn't believe anything was going to improve. This political apathy was demonstrated when, during the referendum for one of the many constitutions the Dutch people would be asked to approve, the voter turnout rate was 4%. Still, there were a few improvements made due to them being a French client state. For example, they standardised the taxation and education system across the lands, with luxury goods being taxed at a higher rate than non-luxury goods. Now, Napoleon sought to irrevocably intertwine the governments of the Netherlands and France, to ensure the Netherlands would be ruled by his family forever. In 1806, the Batavian Republic was abolished and replaced with the Kingdom of Holland, with King Louis, Napoleon's brother, as his king. Napoleon's brother increased state surveillance and repression. Despite this, he did a surprisingly good job of ruling, considering he was working for a foreign tyrant. King Louis of Holland worked to preserve the national identity of the Dutch people, and whenever a major tragedy took place, like a flood or a gunpowder explosion, he would personally visit the site of that tragedy. He also defended Holland from his own brother, resisting Napoleon's efforts to replace the Dutch legal code with the French legal code. And he even resisted Napoleon's efforts to implement conscription within the country. And that one's incredibly important. In the Treaty of The Hague, several territories of the Netherlands had been given over to France. In those places, conscription had been implemented by the French government, and that had pushed those French annexed places to the edge of revolt. But the main thing Louis did to make his brother angry was that he refused to fully enforce the continental system. You see, in November of 1806, a few months after Louis had been made King of Holland, Napoleon had announced something called the Continental System, or the Continental Blockade. What this meant was that everyone in Europe would be expected to cease trade with the British. The idea was obviously to harm the economy of Napoleon's greatest enemy. However, ceasing trade with Britain to harm their economy also has the opposite effect of harming Europe's economy. The continental system would go on to be Napoleon's undoing. He would go on to invade Portugal, then Spain, and then Russia to enforce the continental system. All 3 of them would go on to repulse this invasion, and all 3 of them would go on to counterattack by invading France and overthrowing his regime. But Napoleon's regime wouldn't fall until 1814. Currently, in 1806, the Netherlands was getting economically obliterated by not being able to trade with Britain. In 1805, the year directly preceding the economic embargo, almost 2,400 merchant ships entered the Amsterdam harbour. In 1810, after 4 years of embargo, that number was down to 210. Louis did at least try a bit to enforce this blockade. However, the thing that made Napoleon angry was that Louis didn't put as much work into enforcing the blockade as Napoleon would have liked. For example, Louis was extremely lenient when it came to smugglers and anybody who wanted to secretly violate the blockade. This fact, along with a few other things, led Napoleon to the conclusion that his brother was not fit to rule the country. So in 1810, he annexed the Netherlands, along with parts of the North German coast. Now that Napoleon was directly in charge, he began cracking down on any and all trade with the British. Do you remember how I said in 1810, 210 merchant ships, and this is merchant ships of any country, not just the British, entered the Amsterdam harbour? Well, in 1811 that number was down to 0. Another thing that Napoleon did under his reign was he required all Dutch citizens to give over a lot of their information to the government. This included information like births, deaths, marriages, divorces, addresses, and today that's a very normal thing that every government does, pretty much. But at the time, that was considered a huge breach of privacy and angered a lot of people. It also required people to have a surname, and in the East, having a surname was something that very few people did. In fact, it would be decades before everybody in the country was using the surname that they still officially had. Still, French domination and later direct rule in the Netherlands did go a long way to centralising the country and making people stop viewing themselves as a citizen of their hometown or their home state and start viewing themselves as a collective, as part of the Dutch population rather than as part of the whatever town they came from. In 1812, Napoleon took 15,000 Dutch troops with him into his invasion of Russia. 500 returned. During their counteroffensive, Russian forces came in and kicked the French out of the Netherlands. Napoleon's regime was over. The stadtholder that had been exiled from the Netherlands, the last stadtholder of the Netherlands, was dead. But his son really wanted to restore his family's power over the lost territory. So he returned to the Netherlands and declared himself King of the Netherlands. Napoleon's rule had been a dark time in the history of the Netherlands. Now, the new king had big plans to make his country great again. Part 8. How did you afford that giant luxury boat, sire? So now that Napoleon was gone, the Allies had to decide what was to be done with the southern Netherlands. It was immediately determined that neither Prussia nor France could have it, because that could upset the balance of power in Europe. In the late 1780s, a war of independence had begun against the Austrians, in which the Belgians tried to establish an independent republic, and every province except for Luxembourg had joined in. This rebellion eventually failed, but when the war with France began and France eventually invaded the Austrian Netherlands, many Belgians hoped that France would create an independent republic in the region. This never happened. France annexed them. However, now that the wars were over, many Belgians hoped they'd be granted independence. This didn't happen, because it was determined that an independent Belgian republic would be so weak it would almost immediately be conquered by France. Some Belgians wanted to return to Austrian rule, but Austria said they didn't want the territory back. That left only one option. The southern Netherlands would be given over to King William I of the Netherlands. So the House of Orange was given control of all of the Low Countries, and Britain even agreed to give back some of the Dutch Empire, although they only gave the empire back if they abolished the slave trade in the empire. The Allies also told the Dutch king to give religious equality to all people in the Netherlands. They did this not because they cared about human rights, they didn't care at all, but because they wanted to stop the entire country from tearing itself apart inside out. You see, the king was a Protestant, and over half the population in the northern half was also Protestant. But overall, the country was nearly 3/4 Roman Catholic. Basically, a Protestant king running a majority Catholic population was an absolute recipe for disaster, and so the Allies hoped that by forcing the king to grant religious equality to the Catholics, they could stop people from getting angry at each other. So the king's constitution ended up including religious equality, and it also included a bunch of other clauses that gave the king a lot of power and other people not that much power. Although to be fair, the parliament in the Netherlands still did have a lot more power than the parliament in, say, Denmark or Prussia, for instance. Next, the king had to get people to vote on his constitution. In the northern half of the country, he called the government together and asked them to vote for his constitution, which they did unanimously. In the southern half of the country, he found a bunch of important people, put them together in a committee, and told them to vote for his constitution. Unfortunately for the king, these people seemed to have misunderstood the assignment, because they voted against his constitution by a very large margin. At this point, the king realised that if he wanted to get his constitution passed, he was going to have to employ a complex mathematical equation. People go to university for 10 years to understand this, and they still struggle to fully comprehend this mathematical equation. The Belgians would come to call this Dutch arithmetic. Here's how Dutch arithmetic works. Basically, if somebody voted for your constitution, they meant it and they voted for their constitution. But if someone abstained from voting for your constitution, they were only joking, they actually meant to say yes to it. And if somebody voted against your constitution, they were only joking, they actually meant to say yes. Allow me to elaborate further. You'll notice that earlier I drew special attention to the clause in the Constitution that guaranteed religious equality. Well, this part of the Constitution was actually the reason that many of the people who voted against the Constitution voted against the Constitution, because of the fact that religious equality was the last thing that many Catholics wanted. But you'll remember that the only reason this clause is there was because the Allies told the king to put the clause there. And the king then says, well, that part of the Constitution is non-negotiable. We don't have a choice whether or not to put it in there, because I was only granted this territory under the condition that I put that clause in there. So, says the king, if you voted against my constitution on the grounds of religious equality, your vote does not count. Therefore, you are going to be marked down as having voted in favour of the constitution. And then the king went ahead and changed all the abstention votes to yes votes as well, just for some reason, I guess, because if you don't vote against something, you're implicitly consenting to it, according to him. And so all of a sudden, the constitution passed. Yes, that's right, kids. Did you know you can just win democracy by simply cracking open the ballot box and then just adding and removing certain bits of paper until the result says what you want it to say? Who knew? So anyway, the king's constitution passed. Speaking of emulating Napoleon, many of Napoleon's old civil servants that had worked for him or his puppets continued to work in the Dutch government. And while Dutch courts handed out less harsh sentences than Napoleon's courts had handed out, the king basically left Napoleon's network of spies, informants, and secret police in place and continued to use it to suppress dissenters. Free speech was also clamped down upon. Journalists were frequently prosecuted for criticising the king. Now let's talk about the financial state of the country. Politics is an ever-changing subject with different people caring about different things at different points in time. But there is one issue that pretty much everybody has always cared about in every time period and in every country: the economy. Food is a universal human necessity, and you need an economy to be able to eat, and so pretty much every human throughout history has cared about the economy. And so, if a ruler can simply maintain economic growth throughout the entirety of their reign, then it is almost impossible for the people to overthrow them. I mean, think about it. When was the last time you heard of a successful revolution in an economically stable country? So, let's look at the financial situation in the Netherlands. By 1804, the national debt had more than doubled in the last 10 years to 1.1 billion guilders. And by 1807, national debt was equivalent to 225% of the government income. So King William had inherited a very unstable economy from Napoleon. So to fix this, he began investing in businesses in economically impoverished areas. Unfortunately, these investments had a tendency to fail, which only increased the national debt. So now, King William has an unbelievably high national debt, and he has to pay it off. And he comes up with a cunning plan to pay it off. He is going to tax the Belgians at a rate so high they've never even seen it before. Pretty soon, 45 to 50% of government income is coming from the southern half of the country, and only 20 to 23% of government spending is going there. So where was all this extra money going? Well, quite a lot of it was going to pay off the enormous national debt that the government owed to wealthy business owners. However, a lot of it was also going to benefit the investments of the king's inner circle. And the king himself had a tendency to dip his fingers very deep into the government budget and then not say what he was going to do with all that money. Apart from economics, another issue that affects lots of people is religion. So let's see how well that's going in the country. I mentioned earlier that the southern half of the country was mostly Catholic, while the northern half of the country was mostly Calvinist. I also mentioned that the Allies were afraid that a Protestant king ruling a Catholic population could end in some bloodshed. And how's that going? Well, the king's ultimate goal was to unite Catholics and Protestants into one state-controlled church. And to that end, he was beginning to gain more and more influence over the Protestant and Jewish churches. Meanwhile, The Catholics were resisting all of his attempts at domination, but he wasn't giving up. Thanks to the king, an enlightened Christian constitution was being taught in schools, and any candidate for priesthood would only be able to study in a school that was opened by the government with a curriculum controlled by the government. William was not popular among Catholics. To be fair, the king did do a couple of successful infrastructure projects, and that was a good thing that he did, but he also infuriated people by requiring that all bureaucracy be done in the Dutch language rather than the French, and he didn't give anybody any time to learn Dutch, even if they didn't speak it. He also, apparently, conscripted journalists that had been banished from France to basically talk shit about the Belgian people every day. And so now you see we have two main groups of people who don't like the king. We've got the liberals, who don't like his autocratic policies, and then we've got the Catholics, who don't like his efforts to curb the power of their religion. And in 1828, these two groups of people formed an alliance in order to demand their rights. All of this meant that between 1828 and 1830, the king received about 350,000 signatures worth of petitions. On top of this, in 1830, the French launched their own revolution and overthrew their king, inspiring many of the Belgians to want to do the same. Meanwhile, also in 1830, there was a recession in the textile industry, causing increased labour unrest. Finally, one thing, just one tiny little thing was needed to push everybody over the edge. And that thing was a play called La Muetta di Portici. This play is based on a true story about the Neapolitan Revolt of 1647, and it first premiered in 1828. I actually read that play while writing this part of the video, and it's honestly not that bad. This play isn't interesting enough to deserve a video of its own, and so I considered adding a segment in this video where I just analysed all the philosophy and the symbolism in this play and everything, but then I realised that it's not worth it. So all I am going to say is that it's quite interesting that this was the play that inspired people to revolt. I mean, yes, it is a play about revolution, and I guess that could inspire people to do a revolution. However, it's worth noting, it doesn't glorify revolution, it's not a rousing speech. From what I can tell, this is a cautionary tale about the dangers of going too far. In my opinion, this play is meant to be a parody of the French Revolution and the Great Terror, and it points out that yes, revenge can in fact go too far. I think it's fitting then that the song in this musical that inspired people to revolt wasn't a song at the end of the play celebrating that their revolution had succeeded. It was a song that was sung in only the second act, I believe, before the revolution had even began. The version that I read is translated to English, so it's possible that some of the wording is wrong, but either way, the lyrics of the song are as follows. Better to die than remain miserable. Is there any danger for a slave? Fall the yoke that oppresses us, and under our blows perish the stranger. Sacred love of the fatherland, give us back boldness and pride. To my country I owe my life. It will owe me its freedom. So in 1830, a bunch of people were watching this play about revolution, and that inspires them to go out and do a revolution. They start rioting in the streets, and soon enough, those riots grow. They spread to the other cities nearby, and soon enough, a provisional government is formed and a national militia to fight off the Dutch. The king sends 10,000 soldiers to retake Brussels. Volunteers, hundreds of them, pour in from around the country to fight off the invaders. The Dutch army suffers a 15% casualty rate before falling back. The five great powers of Europe immediately call a meeting to decide what to do about the situation in Belgium. At the committee, France sensed an opportunity to annex Belgium, and so they declared themselves in support of the revolution. Britain would much rather the revolution failed, but they decided that it was impossible to defeat this revolution now, and so they reluctantly sided with the rebels. Prussia, Austria, and Russia were all absolutely horrified at the situation going on, and Russia committed 60,000 troops to crush the revolt. Inconveniently for the Russians, there was a revolt in Poland against their rule, tying down Russian soldiers and making it pretty difficult for the Russians to support the Dutch. So it became pretty clear that there was no way to defeat the rebellion now. The Belgians were going to have to be recognised as independent, so now they had to decide who was going to be the new King of Belgium. A member of the French royal family was offered the Belgian throne. Britain told France that if they accepted that offer, they would declare war on France, because Britain was never in a million years going to let France annex Belgium, and Britain installed a member of their own royal family on the Belgian throne. In 1831, the Belgian Provisional Government published the new constitution for their country. The constitution included 4 basic rights: the freedom of religion, education, of free speech, and of association. This makes sense. As I mentioned earlier, many of the grievances that the Belgian people had related to these 4 rights. However, the constitution also took inspiration from things like the Declaration of the Rights of Man. This was a document published during the French Revolution by the French revolutionaries, explaining what their aims were. But apart from their own struggles and the French Revolution, there was also another place that the constitution took inspiration from: the British. The Belgians decided that their form of government was going to be very similar to the British form of government, i.e. they were going to have a 2-chamber system. The first chamber was directly elected by the people. This chamber suggested laws and voted on them, and then those laws would also have to be approved by a second chamber. This chamber was partially voted on by the people, but it was also going to be partially hereditary and partially co-opted. Although I should clarify, when I say that these chambers were elected by the people, what I mean is people in a ridiculously high tax bracket. Less than 2% of the population were rich enough to vote. Also, the country was going to be in a constitutional monarchy. So, Belgium's independent, they're no longer ruled by the Dutch king, they have a democracy, but they're independent, so yeah, things seem to be going pretty alright. What could possibly go wrong? Oh wait! Because while all of the great powers, France, Britain, Austria, Prussia and Russia, have all agreed to recognise Belgian independence, there is one person who hasn't agreed to recognise Belgian independence: King William of the Netherlands, along with his entire population. The entirety of the Dutch Republic is wholeheartedly in favour of crushing the Belgian revolt. So, they put together an army of 40,000 men and send it south to retake Brussels. They inflict 2 major defeats on the Belgian army and occupy a key Belgian city, and it looks like they're going to win. Literally nothing could possibly stop them from retaking Brussels and reconquering all of their lost land. But then, never fear, France is here. 70,000 French troops cross into the country to drive out the Netherlands. The Dutch don't even bother trying to fight the French. As soon as 70,000 French troops enter the country, they know it's over, and they immediately began heading north. However, the Dutch do try and hold on to 2 remaining cities. In 1832, a French assault retakes one of the remaining cities controlled by the Netherlands. So a few months earlier, before the Dutch attempt to retake Belgium, the great powers had presented peace terms to Belgium and the Netherlands, which they were expected to agree to. However, neither one of these 2 countries agreed to the peace terms. The Netherlands didn't agree to the peace terms on the grounds that that would involve recognising Belgian independence, and Belgium didn't agree to the peace terms on the grounds that it would force them to give large chunks of territory back to the Netherlands. This included much of Limburg and half of Luxembourg, and those, by the way, were places which had played a very large role in the revolution against the Netherlands, so it seemed quite unfair to have to give them back so easily. So neither side was going to agree to the peace terms, and in 1832, fighting died down. Finally, in 1838, 8 years after the revolution began, the King of the Netherlands, William, decided it was finally time to bow to reality. He decided he would rather get back some of his land than none of his land. So, he agreed to the peace terms. Belgium didn't want to agree to the peace terms, but they were a small and not very powerful country, so they couldn't really do much about it. Belgium agreed to the peace terms and handed back half of Luxembourg and much of Limburg. And I would be remiss not to mention the huge historical significance this revolution had on the course of human history. You see, it is very possible that Britain and France would not have been able to win World War I without this revolution. You see, in 1914, Germany went to Belgium and told Belgium that they wanted to move hundreds of thousands of troops through Belgian territory in order to attack France. This would allow them to sidestep the French army, stopping the German advance in Alsace-Lorraine. Now, I cannot make this clear enough. If Belgium had said yes to that deal, Germany would have won World War I without a doubt. German troops would have marched through Belgium unopposed, and they would have made it to Paris without almost a single French soldier to stop them. France would not have had time to readjust its troops, and Britain would not have had time to get reinforcements to the continent to stop the German advance. But instead, Belgium did the brave thing, and they said no. They said, Germany, you can take your armies and you can shove them up where the sun don't shine. And so, Germany invaded Belgium. Now, Belgium, being a tiny country fighting a giant great power, didn't really have much of a chance against Germany. They lost. However, Belgium slowed down the German advance just enough that France and Britain were able to readjust their troops to stop the German advance towards Paris. Now, to be clear, even with the Belgian obstacle, German troops were still able to drive so deep into French territory that they were literally within shelling distance of Paris. And that was with Belgian support. Belgium slowed the German advance just enough that Britain and France could claw a victory by the skin of their eyeball. But you might be thinking, Ben, surely if the Netherlands had controlled the region, the same thing could have happened. The Netherlands would have slowed the German advance just enough. In fact, it was a larger country, so they could have slowed the German advance even more and allowed Britain and France the time they needed to come in and save the day. But I'm not so certain that's the case. You see, in 1830, Britain issued a decree saying they would protect Belgian sovereignty unconditionally no matter what. I.e., if Germany ever tries to use Belgium as a path to enter France, Britain will stop them. But as far as I know, the Netherlands had no such guarantee of defence from Britain. Sure, the Netherlands was a neutral country. I believe it was actually the first by-law neutral country in Europe. However, Belgium didn't reject the German demands because it was a neutral country. Belgium rejected the German demands because they believed that Britain would come and help them out. And Britain did try to help them out. But if the Netherlands didn't have any guarantee of British support, what reason would they have to think that anyone was coming to help them against Germany? So if the Netherlands had controlled Belgium in 1914, and Germany had demanded that the Netherlands let them through their territory to get to France, well, the Netherlands would have had no reason to believe that anybody was coming to help them against the Germans, because they didn't have a guarantee of support from Britain, and so they may well have just let Germany pass through their territory, and France would have fallen in a matter of weeks. That said, it is possible that the Netherlands would eventually have received a guarantee of support from Britain. I think it's highly likely, considering how scared Britain was of Germany. However, it's not guaranteed, meaning I stand by the claim that it is highly possible that the Belgian Revolution saved France from certain doom in World War I. Now, I would love to continue teaching you about history, but unfortunately, that's where our story ends. So goodbye! But don't go! How much information do you think you attained from watching this video? And I promise this isn't a sponsor. Well, if you think you attained a lot of information from this video, then I would like to invite you to come and prove that. You see, I'm going to design a Kahoot quiz based on the information within this video. And in a couple of weeks after this video drops, I'm going to do a live stream in which I host that Kahoot quiz, and I'm going to see which one of you paid attention to this video. If that sounds like something you'd be interested in, make sure to show up at the time and date on screen now, and sign up to the Kahoot quiz. After the Kahoot quiz, I'll take requests for other Kahoot quizzes that you want me to do. For example, if you've made a Kahoot quiz yourself, or if there's a specific Kahoot quiz you want me to do, we can do that one. And then after we're finished with Kahoot quizzes, I guess I'll take questions, either about myself or about the video or about the history of the Netherlands. If you do have any questions, that would be great, and you can ask them live and I'll try and reply off the cuff. However, I would much prefer if you ask those questions in a comment under this video or under this community post first. That way you can give me a chance to plan my answer. That will give me a chance to plan out my answer so that when you ask it on stream, I'll know what to say. So after I've taken questions, I guess I'll ask if there's anything else you want me to do on the internet. I don't know if there's any other videos you want me to react to or something. And then I think the stream will be done, probably. I haven't done a stream in a while, so I'm very excited and very nervous. We'll see how this goes. Bye! And thanks for watching, obviously.